Hello, everyone. All right, so now we're going to talk about national income and the standard of living. Okay, so we're continuing on our series on economics, macroeconomics to be precise, and we'll be talking about national income and the standard of living. So let's go. All right, so how do we define national income? What's the definition of national income? We have that right here, and that is the total net value of all goods and services produced in a nation over a specified period of time, representing the sum of wages, profits, rents, interest, and pension payments to residents of the nation. So, national income measures the value of final goods and services produced in an economy over a period of time, usually a year, right? So, how do we measure this? We can measure this via output. Output measures the final value of output of different sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, manufacturing, services. We can also measure that by expenditure, which measures the spending by all the different sectors of the economy, such as households, the government, foreign buyers, um, on a country's final goods and services. Or we could measure this by income. So income measures all of the earnings in the economy. For example, the income earned by companies, corporations, employees, and the self-employed. All right. However, we measure national income, it should give us the same answer. So our output should be equal to our expenditure, and that should be equal to our income. All right, let's look at some measures of national income. We'll start with the gross domestic product, the GDP. The GDP measures the value of final goods and services produced in an economy. It shows how much has been earned within a country's national boundaries over a given period, usually a year. Now, what you have to take into consideration is what's been earned within a country's national boundaries. So within the boundaries of the country, right? Over a given period, usually a year. How is this different from the gross national product, the GNP? Let's look at that. The GNP measures the value of final goods and services earned by the country's nationals, as opposed to the amount of money earned within the country over a given period, usually a year. So what are we saying? What's been earned by the country's nationals, okay, as opposed to earned within the country over a given period. So we're going to have to take into consideration what's been earned from our nationals abroad, and we're going to have to take out of our GDP what other nationals within our boundaries have earned during that same period. So we're going to take out income earned by households and firms within our boundaries, and we're going to add what's been earned by our nationals within other boundaries or other countries abroad. Okay, so that's how we measure the GDP and the GNP. So this is how you measure the GNP, the gross national product. The gross national product is your GDP minus income earned by overseas firms and households located within an economy, plus income earned by the country's households and firms working abroad. So for instance, the GNP of the UK would be the GDP of the UK minus income earned by overseas firms and households located within the UK, plus income earned by the UK's households and firms abroad. All right. Another way of looking at it would just be your GDP plus net income from abroad. So net income from abroad is all of this thing right here. All right. The World Bank has started to use the GNI rather than the GNP. So what's the difference between GNI and GNP? Well, your GNI just takes into consideration subsidies, so it takes away subsidies, and also takes into consideration compensation of employees and property income from abroad. All right, so they're very similar, but you have to take into consideration subsidies and compensation of employees and property from abroad. Another measure of national income would be your net national product. What's that? Your net national product takes care of depreciation. So it's basically your gross national product minus depreciation. Why do we do that? That's because some of the national income earned in a year is simply spent replacing the depreciation of assets rather than genuinely adding new output to the economy. For example, if you're buying an equipment to replace old machines that have stopped working, you're not increasing the productive capacity of the economy. All you're doing is replacing the depreciation, the wear and tear that has happened to those machines. So depreciation refers to the wear and tear of assets. So net national product is simply GNP minus depreciation. Next, we need to consider the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP. What do we mean by real GDP? Real GDP is equal to the economic output adjusted for the effects of inflation. So for instance, say last year's GDP was 100 billion pounds. This year's GDP is 102 billion pounds. So you can see we've had an increase of what, 2%? So if we just take this as a sign that the economy has grown by 2%, that might be slightly misleading, because even though the income of households or firms, adding all this together has increased by 2%, we don't know what's happened to the price level. Okay, so we don't know what's happened to the price level. So we need to adjust for the price level, which is inflation. Remember that the price level tells us about the inflation in the economy. Say the inflation this year has been 4%, for instance. It means we're not actually better off. Our nominal GDP, which is what we have here, nominal GDP is the economic output without the inflation adjusted. Our nominal GDP is that figure there, 102 billion. But our real GDP, we need to take into consideration this 4% that we have sort of lost because of this price level. All right. So the main difference between nominal and real values is that real values are adjusted for inflation, while nominal values are not. As a result, nominal GDP will often appear higher than real GDP. In this case, our nominal GDP, without going too much into the details, will look like 102 billion, but our real GDP, if we adjust for it, because of this 4%, might be closer to 98 billion, or 98% of our GDP from the last year. Okay, so our real GDP is 98% of what happened last year. Our nominal GDP looks like 102%. So the main difference is that nominal GDP is not adjusted for inflation, but real GDP is adjusted. Now, if you notice, we've been talking about monetary values, okay? So we've been talking in terms of income, expenditure, and output. But this doesn't relate to the standard of living. Normally, the more you earn, the better your standard of living should be. Okay, so what is the standard of living? The standard of living is the level of wealth, comfort, material goods, and necessities available to a certain socio-economic class or a certain geographic area. So what we're saying is, how well do we live? Okay, what's our level of wealth, comfort, material goods, necessities? Okay, do we have running water? Do we have electricity? Do we have roads? Do we have good schools? Do we have healthcare? Okay, if we have all these things in abundance, then we have a good standard of living. So a standard of living is how well or how poorly a person or a group of people live in terms of having their needs and wants met. An example of a high standard of living is a wealthy person who can buy anything he wants, anyone who can buy anything she wants, right? An example of a low standard of living is a poor person who does not have enough food or water. So how do we measure the standard of living? Measuring the standard of living is really easy. We usually measure this by this formula right here. We use the real GDP per capita to measure the standard of living. And how do we do this? We find the real GDP and we divide that by the population. So the real GDP as opposed to the nominal GDP divided by the population. All right? For example, If the real GDP in the UK in 2016 is 1.5 trillion, I'm not sure what the figure is or what the figure was for that year, but let's just say hypothetically it was 1.5 trillion. The population in the UK in that year was about, say, 65 million people. In order to calculate the real GDP per capita and measure the standard of living for individuals on average in the UK, we would just find the total GDP per capita, real GDP per capita was 1.5 trillion, and divide that by the population, which is 65 million, okay? And the figure we will get, the real GDP per capita in the UK for that year would be 23,077 pounds, okay? And this would measure our standard of living. So on average, this would mean that the average human in the UK is what, or has about 23,077 pounds. So that's how you measure the standard of living. So we have talked about the real GDP per capita as a measure of the standard of living, but the problem with the real GDP per capita is it has some limitations. For example, it doesn't tell us about the quality of goods and services produced in the country. So black and white TVs as opposed to color TVs, for instance. It doesn't tell us anything about the quality of life, how much leisure time people have, what's their work-life balance. It says nothing about non-marketed items, things that we don't pay for. For example, if you hire a plumber or if you do it yourself, it tells us nothing about the shadow economy, so things people don't report because they don't want to pay taxes. It says nothing about environmental issues. It says nothing about wealth and inequality. So there are a lot of things that are not captured by the real GDP per capita. So there's this thing called the Human Development Index, okay, the HDI, which is what we have here. All right. Now the HDI is a summary measure of average achievement dimensions of human development, like a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, or having a decent standard of living. So it's a composite statistic, composite index between 0 and 1 of life expectancy, education, and per capita income indicators. And we use this to rank countries into 4 tiers of human development, okay? Now, a country would score higher if the lifespan is higher, education is higher, and real GDP per capita is higher. Okay, so what dimensions do we have in there? We have long and healthy life, we have knowledge, and we have a decent standard of living. Okay, so long and healthy life, we measure this by your life expectancy at birth. Okay, so that gives us your life expectancy index. Knowledge, we measure this by expected years of schooling, you know, your mean years of schooling in the country, and that will give us your education index. Your GNI per capita here would measure your decent standard of living. All right, and that will give us our GNI index, and we sort of make a composite. You know, we have an average of this, we summarize this, and then we have the Human Development Index. So this is more holistic because it doesn't just tell us about your GNI or your GDP per capita, it tells us about education and life expectancy, which is more, gives us more information than just a simple GDP per capita. Now, the issue with both measures of the standard of living that we have looked at is these measures of standard of living did not tell us anything about the inequality within the economy. So both the GDP per capita and the HDI index told us nothing whatsoever about inequality. Now, let's go back to that example of GDP per capita in the UK. We got that in that example for 2016, that GDP per capita was about what, 23,077 pounds, right? Now, we know that within the economy, within the nation, there are going to be people who are earning or who are what a lot more than that figure, and there are going to be people who are earning who are what a lot less than that figure, okay? So what we've just had is an average, okay? Now, if we want to look at the level of inequality, we're going to look at the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality within an economy. The higher the Gini coefficient, the greater the inequality. So Gini coefficient is between 0 and 1. 0 meaning total equality, 1 meaning absolute inequality. Okay, so if you had a choice to choose between two countries, one of them had a Gini coefficient of 0.3, the other one had a Gini coefficient of 0.7, same national income, you didn't know if you were going to be a rich or a poor person, you just had to choose one of the countries and you wanted equality, you would probably want to go to this country right here with the lower Gini coefficient. All right. Okay, let's look at an example looking at the Lorenz curve, or the line of absolute equality. So we have here this line of absolute equality. If we're here, then there's absolute equality, right? So on our vertical axis here, we have percentage of national income. On our horizontal axis here, we have percentage of the population. Okay, so we have that there, right? Okay, now let's see if we can use this line of absolute equality to measure the amount of inequality, to look at, say, the Gini coefficient. All right, now let's look at if we're on the line of absolute equality and we're looking at 50% of the national income here, right? That would be owned by 50% of the people. So that's equal, right? But let's look at country X, where there is some amount of inequality. Okay, let's look at country X over here. All right, what do we have? We have that 50% of the national income is owned by about 70% of the population. That's, okay, so 50% owned by 70% of the population. How about for country Y over here? Okay, now we can see 50% of the national income is owned by, is that about 80%? Okay, about 80% of the population. Okay, so you can see that country Y is slightly less equal than country X. All right, we could have a situation where it's so badly skewed. Okay, what if we had something like this, for instance, where just 1% of the population had 1% of the population had 90% of the resources, and that would be very bad. So you can look at this and look at the level of inequality within the economy, within the nation. Okay, and we don't want a lot of inequality. We want equality, because then people think things are fair and things are going on better. So what are the other factors other than income that affect the standard of living? We could look first at the quality of goods and services provided. So for instance, if this year we have better smartphones, okay, or we have better airplanes, or we have better cars, if the prices are lower but they're better, the national income might look as if it's worse, right? But the quality is better. All right, the quality of life, how much time do I have to spend on things I love, how much time do I get to spend with my family, with my friends, and have to spend with work, because I need a good work-life balance. So I go to my job, I enjoy it, I want to work, but then I want time for other activities. So the quality of life as a whole, okay, how good is my health and things like that, they are not captured in income, but they affect the standard of living. Non-marketed items, okay, so there's certain things that are not marketed, okay, so maybe I do things like I fix my plumbing myself, I fix my electricity myself, I am kind to people, I smile, things like that. Okay, they affect the standard of living. They're not monetary. So the black economy, okay, so work that has been done but is not declared, okay, so things I do by myself, all right, so I take care of my parents, for instance, as opposed to getting a carer, things like that. Environmental issues. So how good is the water? How good is the air? Pollution. If I'm in a place where there's radioactivity, that would affect my standard of living. And wealth inequality. What's the level of wealth as a whole in the country? Okay, so I'm thinking of how well am I perceived? If for instance last year we had a lot of growth. This year it might look like we're doing worse, but we already have wealth. or maybe wealth from previous generations. So maybe if generations previously have stored up a lot of wealth, this would feed into my standard of living this year, or at this period, okay, as opposed to coming up with new wealth. So this stock of old wealth can also help the standard of living. Now, why don't we feel happy despite more wealth, so more GDP? So if you look at the stock of world GDP and world wealth, we definitely have more wealth. There's more stuff, better smartphones and everything. But, you find that more people are saying they're depressed than ever. Okay, so why don't we feel happy despite more wealth? Okay, so why is it GDP is growing, but people are unhappy? Why do we have depression and all these things? A big factor is comparing ourselves to others. So you're always comparing yourself to the Joneses. Oh, I have this, but that person has more. Even though you're better off. Okay, so that leads to depression. Advertising, in marketing, in advertisement, you see all kinds of unrealistic stuff. People maybe take a spoon of something, or maybe they have this eyeliner, or they put on this makeup, and your life is so amazing. So it gives you unrealistic expectations. And we know marriage is good. Marriage helps us live longer. Okay, so loneliness is a very, very bad destroyer of human happiness. Okay, so you can have all this stuff, but you're lonely. Okay, so marriage, we also know when we take surveys, married people always say they're better. We don't know if they're being forced to say so by their wives or their husbands, but they always say that they're better and they're happier. So what's your class activity for the week? The first one is, why are the various measures of national income important? So why do we have all these measures of national income, and why are they important? And how can we get happy despite the results of national income? So say, the national income isn't looking too well for this year. How can you still be happy? What can you do to put a smile in your face? What can you do even to better maybe next year's national income? So how can we be happy despite results of national income? So once again, class activity, why are the various measures of national income important, and how can we get happy despite results of national income? All right, that's it for this week. See you later. Have a good week and be good. Bye for now.